All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today's webinar, which is Brain Injury 102. This is the second of three sessions in our virtual brain injury education series, our webinar format. And just as a reminder, last week's session, Brain Injury 101, which covered the basics of brain injury, is now available on our YouTube channel. And so this webinar is also going to be recorded and posted there as well. And so just to get us started, a friendly reminder for those who joined last time, or if you're new to today's webinar, Brain Injury Services is a recovery partner for people with brain injuries. And so we work to repair lives, recover possibility, and restore hope. And our service area includes all of the Northern Virginia region, all the way up from Frederick County and Winchester down through King George and Caroline County. And so again, since this webinar will be recorded, you can access the recording of this webinar as well as a lot of other educational content under our resources tab on our website, which is braininjuryservices.org, or again, that will link you directly to our YouTube channel. And there is our YouTube channel. It is called Brain Injury Services. And so, today's session again is Brain Injury 102. And so in last week's session, Brain Injury 101, again, that was the basics of brain injury, including the symptoms and common impacts. And so in today's session, we're going to talk more about holistic wellness and some practical recovery strategies that survivors can use in their day-to-day routines. And then in next week in Brain Injury 103, we're going to review what's offered here at Brain Injury Services to support you in your recovery journey. And in today, and talking about holistic wellness, we're going to talk specifically about the science of brain injury recovery, including terms such as neuroplasticity, cognitive reserve, and the growth mindset. In addition, we're going to talk again about those practical strategies. So those will address physical, cognitive, emotional, and social recovery strategies. And just as a quick disclaimer, some of the topics that we address may be sensitive or bring up strong emotions. And so if you feel distressed, of course, your camera is not visible on this recording, but please feel free to take a break, step away if you need, and rejoin when ready. Or if you're watching the recorded version of this webinar, you can always pause and rejoin later. As another reminder, brain injuries are not completely identical. And so what we share may or may not apply to your specific situation and what you need. And so lastly, this session is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. So please consult with your healthcare provider or physician for specific guidance on your personal health history or your treatment recommendations. And another quick housekeeping reminder, just in terms of confidentiality. This webinar series, again, is going to be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel. And so if you're joining us live, your chat or Q&A messages will be visible to us and other participants attending live, but your name and image and your comments will not be visible on the recording. And near the end of this course, we're going to share a link to our feedback survey. And so if you are joining us live today, please at the end of this webinar, click on that link and fill out this quick survey to help us really make sure we continue to improve the offerings here at Brain Injury Services, as well as, benefiting our other clients who are attending. And so to get us started, I'm going to pass it over to Sheridan to explain a little bit about the growth mindset.
Thank you, Jess. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So, we're going to kick it off talking a little bit about mindset as a foundation for recovery. And we'll get into that on the next couple of slides. So, before we dig into recovery strategies, it helps to look at how we approach or think about recovery. And this will be represented by our mindset. We're talking about this first because this is what sets the stage for a solid foundation for emotional and physical well being, which is crucial as we approach recovery. So, first, we'll talk about fixed mindset, and then we'll move on to growth mindset, which you see represented on this slide. On the left side, the grayed out version of the brain represents the fixed mindset, and on the right, the colorful rainbow version represents the growth mindset. So, first, a fixed mindset is a belief that abilities like memory, focus, or problem solving, other skills that we have, are set and they can't change. So, what we've got is what we've got. And after a big change in our bodies or how our brains work, like after a brain injury, it is natural to feel stuck in this fixed mindset thinking, especially after the initial or what we might think of as the acute phase. This is really shortly after the injury, where you may see a lot of change and a lot of recovery. Recovery naturally gets slower after this phase, and it's hard to sometimes track progress. It can feel like this is just how things are now, or what we often refer to as the quote, new normal. Actively seeking a growth mindset can help us remember that skills can improve. This takes practice, support, and the right strategies. And despite how slow changes and improvements can seem sometimes, it's important to still recognize those changes. Now, this doesn't mean that pretending recovery is easy. It simply acknowledges that the brain can learn and rewire over time based on the influences upon it, which we're going to talk about a little bit on the next couple of slides. And therefore, this can help us continue to move forward and maintain a momentum that is critical to progress. So, as we discussed in part one of our brain injury education series last week, recent research on neuroplasticity and recovery has shown that even years after an injury, over a decade in some cases, the brain can form new connections, causing improvements in function and even renewed independence in some cases when a person practices skills consistently and intentionally. Because of what we know about the power of mindset in one's approach to every part of life, not just recovery, we know it's a of addressing changes after a brain injury. We know that those who believe improvement is possible tend to stay engaged, motivated, and are even better able to notice progress even when it's small. This focus on the growth mindset doesn't mean that it will fix everything, but it does help us approach challenges differently and persist through inevitable setbacks that life and, of course, recovery after brain injury or chronic illness can throw our way. On the next slide, we'll look at how this shift in thinking can directly influence recovery. So, this slide is going to contrast common roadblocks in our thinking with the growth mindsets that can help unlock recovery. So, let's talk about the first shift, moving from fixing to forward progress. So, the thought, I must fix my brain and go back to who I used to be, can come with a huge sense of pressure and in some cases is just not realistic. It can trap us in the past with an unhelpful focus on changing something that has already occurred. Shifting this to, I am building a new path forward, acknowledges that while things are different, there is still opportunity to move forward. This shifts that focus to progress over perfection, which, let's face it, none of us are going to ever achieve perfection. So that progress is a much more realistic and practical thing to focus on. Next, moving from limitations to adaptations, saying, I just can't do this anymore because I have a brain injury. This can halt our progress and our momentum that we already have. By reframing this to, I'm learning how to do this differently now, we open the door to creative problem solving and strategy use. It changes the goal from doing it the old way to getting it done, which can often involve adapting a task or maybe using a new strategy that can help us to achieve that task or make progress. Finally, a focus on rebuilding resilience is a key aspect of the growth mindset. When setbacks happen, it's easy to feel like I'm just not resilient anymore. I can't handle this pressure like I used to. But resilience isn't a fixed trait that you lose. It's a muscle. Just like we go to the gym to strengthen our muscles, we strengthen our resilience. Resilience grows with repetition. This helps us value the daily effort even when the progress is hard to see or if it feels invisible. These shifts aren't about toxic positivity or ignoring reality. They're practical tools that protect our motivation and directly impact how effectively we use and our physical and cognitive recovery strategies. So that repetition piece is key to regrowing that resilience. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the tools and habits that support this growth focused mindset and the science behind it. So, while I turn it over to Jess, what I'd like everyone who's attending live today or who's watching this webinar is to just think about one mindset shift that you either want to make or that you can use as an example of how to apply some of these principles to this growth mindset we'll be continuing to discuss. So I'll turn it over to Jess to talk a little bit about the science.
All right, thanks, Sheridan. And so again, kind of building on the growth mindset, now we'll talk a little bit about the science that supports this idea. And so the first important term that we want to introduce is neuroplasticity. And so within the brain, our brain cells or our neurons are connected through these different pathways, kind of like a spider web. And so after the brain experiences an injury, it is possible for the brain to naturally reorganize or rewire those connections. In other words, the brain can learn to adapt and function in new and in different ways. This can occur from natural physical recovery over time, as well as intentional efforts to learn new skills or ways of adapting, or by exposing ourselves to new experiences and challenges. And so, thinking back to that growth mindset, like Sheridan said earlier, people who believe improvement is possible tend to stay engaged, motivated, and better able to notice their progress. And so, to summarize all of that, the more you practice, the stronger this becomes. And so these ideas about neuroplasticity are backed up by the research. And so over the past several decades, research has supported the ideas that new brain cells can grow, especially around the hippocampus, well into old age. Cells can rewire, so that neuroplasticity. When there is an injury, it has been shown that one region or one part of the brain can take over or compensate for that damaged region. And cells that fire together wire together, meaning that cell connections are strengthened by activity, such as practicing a skill until it becomes a habit. And then, of course, brain regions can get bigger, faster, and more efficient. Of course, this is not necessarily infinite, but it does suggest that that recovery is an ongoing process. And then lastly, brain injury, post-brain injury neuroplasticity is evident. And so why does this matter? This matters because your brain is adaptable. And so it may not always feel like it, but it is important for us to remind survivors and their families that recovery really is not linear. And so neuroplasticity is that built-in feature of our brains. And so by shifting to a growth mindset and intentionally focusing on ways to enhance our recovery, we're better able to adapt after there's been an injury. And so now that we've talked about neuroplasticity, I'm going to pass it back over to Sheridan to talk about another concept called cognitive reserve.
Thank you, Jess. So now that we've gotten that summary of neuroplasticity and the evidence supporting this idea in brain injury recovery, thanks to Jess, I'm going to introduce another important idea, the cognitive reserve, which you can think of for now as the brain's bank, which we'll unpack a little bit here. So research shows that people who stay active mentally, socially, and physically tend to keep their brains healthier over time. Why is that? Well, it's because these activities help us build up our brain bank reserve. This bank is made up of our accumulated knowledge, skills, experiences, and healthy brain cells. Ultimately, this is what dictates our brain's resilience. So, going back to that term again, the cognitive reserve is the mind's capacity to improvise and find alternative pathways when faced with damage or injury. It's what allows our brains to keep working even when a part of it has been compromised, whether that's because of an injury or because of natural processes in our body, like aging. To visualize how this works in real time, let's look at this traffic analogy on the slide. On the left, we see a visual representation of what happens without cognitive reserve or with an unhealthy cognitive reserve. A brain injury acts like that massive boulder blocking a primary highway. If there are no other roads built, you can see the traffic has completely stopped. In the brain, this is a functional block or representative of a lost ability or skill as a result of that injury. On the right side, we can see a representation of a strong or a resilient cognitive reserve that utilizes neural compensation. It doesn't just stop all the traffic at the boulder because it has a dense web, as Jess mentioned earlier, of alternative pathways already built. So it can quickly, or sometimes not so quickly, but it can get to pathways around the damage or a detour. The thought, the memory, or the movement still reaches its destination by way of using that detour. So we see this in the way that neurons can rebuild themselves after an injury, and also in the way that our capillaries, our veins, and our arteries can adjust as well if blood flow is blocked or if there is a brain bleed as well. Again, this doesn't happen very quickly in a lot of cases, but that cognitive reserve that we've deposited into has a immense impact on this process and this recovery progression. So this brings us back to our brain bank analogy after our traffic analogy. So throughout our lives, we make deposits into our brain bank. So this looks like every time we learn something new, we practice a difficult hobby, participate in a social activity, we are depositing into our brain bank, our brain savings account by building new neural connections. So a brain injury represents a sudden and massive, unexpected withdrawal from that brain bank. If the account has a healthy balance, the brain can be better prepared to absorb that structural loss without going completely bankrupt. But here's the critical connection to our growth mindset. This account is never permanently frozen. During recovery, when patients intentionally practice new strategies, learn adaptive tools, and push through repetition, they're actively continuing to make new deposits into that brain bank. They're rebuilding their balance by investing, proving that we can continue to strengthen our cognitive reserve and open up new detours at any stage of the recovery journey. So, what does it actually mean to invest in your brain? Some of the main ways to keep your brain healthy and keep your brain bank full are going to be talked about on this slide. So, these are lifelong habits can build connection throughout your life before or after a brain injury. So, really quickly, we won't dive deeply into these, but first is to maintain a balanced diet. Nutrients are our brain's fuel for thinking, learning, and healing. Focusing on lean meats, fruits, and vegetables, and avoiding processed foods and sugar are key components of this healthy deposit into our brain bank. I encourage anyone who's interested in learning more about nutrition for brain injury recovery to look into the MIND diet. That's MIND diet. There's a lot of great resources out there about the MIND diet. So take a look at that on your own. A second great way to keep investing in your brain is to move your body regularly. Exercise supports blood flow and brain cell growth. Ideally, 30 minutes of aerobic exercise per day, mixed in with stretching and strength training, based on your individual recommendations by your neurologist or your doctor. So it's always important to check in with your doctor about any exercise routine, as well as any dietary changes that you're making. Another way we can invest in our brain bank is through getting enough sleep, and not just enough sleep, but quality sleep. Sleep habits uh, and sleep help consolidate our memory and our recovery. 7 to 9 hours are the typical recommendation for adults, but some people may need more sleep or intervals of sleep or targeted sleep treatment to find a routine that works for you. Next on our list, stress management. Chronic stress can make thinking, memory, and mood harder to manage. So, learning coping strategies to manage stress is a key component of this investment strategy. Next, staying socially connected, talking, sharing, and being with others, building a community strengthens cognitive and emotional health. And lastly, making sure that we continue to challenge our brain, finding that just right challenge that pushes us to the point of rebuilding some of those connections, but not so much that we're incredibly fatigued. Trying new skills, puzzles, or learning opportunities can help keep your mind active. Even small but consistent actions in these areas can make a difference over time. You can think of each healthy habit as a deposit into your brain bank, adding more resources to your brain that it can then later draw on when you need them. So, with that, I believe I'm handing it over to Jess to talk a little bit about how everything we've covered so far in this course contributes to our idea and approach to a holistic wellness journey.
All right. Thank you, Sheridan. And so to get us started by talking about holistic wellness, what I want to show you is kind of a visual, and that is called the wellness wheel. And so there are a lot of different examples of a wellness wheel online. This is just one example. And so holistic wellness means looking at the whole picture. And so this can be a useful way to think about the different areas of your life, including your physical and mental health, maybe your financial well-being, your social well-being, and so on. And so next, we'll talk through some practical strategies that you can consider to support your overall wellness. And some of these strategies may be things that you already do. And so please take what you need and leave what you don't. So the first few practical strategies that we have listed here are, like Sheridan said, to move your body. And so if 30 minutes a day is recommended, but if that's not something that you can do right now, maybe we can start smaller. And so if you are able, consider walking for just 5 or 10 minutes, whether that is outside or within your home. You might also consider stretching or potentially trying a program such as our virtual gentle chair yoga, which is offered twice a month. Like Sheridan said as well, in terms of nutrition, we can help to support our recovery and our holistic wellness by fueling our bodies. And so this would include making sure we're trying to get enough fruits and vegetables, drinking water every day, and to the extent possible, minimizing excess caffeine, sugar, alcohol, and fast food. Of course, we understand that maybe caffeine is helpful for some people in their recovery. And so all of this is really within reasonable limits. Again, challenging the brain is another practical strategy, and this can look different for everybody. So for some, that is maybe reading or listening to audiobooks if they have visual strain and need to do an auditory version instead. They might try puzzles or brain games. I know that there are a lot of different apps out there now where somebody can play different games to help with their cognition, such as a memory game. You might try something new, or you might try a new hobby. And then, of course, connecting with others. And we know that after brain injury, it can be really socially isolating, and it can sometimes even cause strain on somebody's family or existing relationships. And so when we say connect with others, that could be as simple as calling or texting a friend or loved one just to check in and say hello. Maybe that's joining a group, like a social group or a support group. Or maybe if you're one of our clients, considering our friendship programs, where that would be a one-to-one peer match based on, somebody's common interests and where they live to get that extra social support during their month. And some additional strategies that we have are to prioritize sleep to the best you can. And so, like Sheridan said, each person can be a little bit different in terms of what their sleep really looks like and what they need to support that. But to the extent that you can during your day-to-day, a strategy you can use to support your sleep is to aim for consistent sleep and wake times, meaning going to bed at the same time and trying to wake up around the same time each day. And additionally, maybe building your own nighttime routine to help you kind of wind down and prepare the body and the mind for sleep. And this could be for some people listening to some music, maybe watching a calming show, reading a book, or even doing something light movement. Even a skincare routine is a good example of kind of that consistent routine each night to prepare for bed. Additionally, somebody might practice some relaxation techniques. For some, that is deep breathing or meditation. For others, maybe it's some light movement like yoga or stretching. And for others, it may be just completely quiet time or peaceful music. Maybe somebody finds that white noise to be distracting or even irritating. And so it's a matter of kind of finding what helps you relax specifically. Additionally, spending time in nature can be helpful. That is a practical way for a lot of people to take a few minutes for themselves. And so if you can, try to get some fresh air, even if that is, opening a window. A lot of times we understand that clients have maybe accessibility challenges within their home environment, or if they have problems with, moving about in certain weather conditions, maybe cracking a window a little bit just to breathe some fresh air can be helpful. Maybe spending 5 minutes outside, or even just getting some sunlight when possible. Another strategy is to express yourself. And so creative expression can include journaling, maybe creative writing, different kinds of art, such as drawing, painting, taking photos of things you enjoy, or even coloring. And additionally, music. So whether that is singing along, maybe dancing, or just doing something kind of playful to express yourself and how you feel. And the last couple strategies I want to talk about first is limiting stress and overwhelm. And so Sheridan had mentioned this as well earlier, but some different ways we can do that practically in our day-to-day are to break tasks down into small steps, to prioritize what's most important right now. Maybe you have a huge to-do list and we could focus on, what needs to be done right away or what's most important on this list for me to do right now. You can also practice pacing yourself, being patient with yourself, and considering things like mental health counseling or talk therapy, trying a support group, or even talking to a friend or asking somebody in your life for some support. Maybe you don't know which of these options is going to work best for you. And so if you're a client or a caregiver of client at Brain Injury Services, you are always welcome to reach out to us and just kind of bounce some ideas off of us and see what we can get you connected with. And lastly, we encourage you to celebrate small wins. And that could be any of these examples on screen. And if you're here joining us live, feel free to drop anything else in the chat that you find helps you celebrate those small wins. And so that could be getting out of bed today, maybe cooking a meal, completing a task, pushing yourself, maybe learning something new. Maybe you were patient with yourself today, or you gave yourself some much needed rest. Maybe you were kind today, either to yourself or somebody else. And of course, a small win is just attending this workshop. Being here at all, whether you're watching us live or the recorded version, is definitely a win because you exposed yourself to something new. And hopefully you're learning something from this webinar today. And so now I'm going to pass it back over to Sheridan to talk about some of the major takeaways from today.
Thank you, Jess, and for giving us a lot of those great examples. And as a reminder, it's hard to do a webinar on recovery strategies because, as Jess mentioned at the top of our webinar today, every brain injury and chronic condition comes with a plethora of differences in the way that we experience them. So it's hard to give strategies for recovery because it's so individual. So, as a reminder, we are here at Brain Injury Services to help walk you through the recovery journey and consider a lot of the things that we talked about today based on your individual needs and goals. So, with that in mind, we'll talk through the major takeaways that we're hoping that everyone can get out of today's webinar. So, a reminder about that growth mindset. And I will say, as a caveat to this, the growth mindset isn't something that we really achieve. It is something that is ongoing, that is a constant goal that we are working towards. We can face challenges that challenge that growth mindset. We can kind of ebb and flow from the fixed to the growth mindset. But as long as we kind of remember that difference between the two, believing that we can get back to that growth mindset, that can help us set up that foundation, encouraging the brain to rewire, to send out all of those spiderweb neurons, and adapt, supporting our recovery. Next concept that we talked about today, the cognitive reserve or your brain's bank. This is what is built up from our life experiences, the knowledge that we gain, and the healthy habits that we do to support our brain and body. This cognitive reserve is what gives us the foundation to bounce back from life's withdrawals and maintain long-term brain and body health. And lastly, this underpins the concept of holistic wellness. So, looking at all areas of life, like physical, emotional, social, and cognitive or intellectual health, this supports the cognitive reserve and overall recovery. And these three ideas are connected: the way that we think, the way that we use our brains, and the way that we care for ourselves all influence how well we recover after a brain injury and just how we manage life's challenges in general. So, as we wrap up today, a few key takeaways is the one concept, use it or lose it, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. This just represents the concept of keeping your brain and your body active. This helps recovery and it helps maintain the skills and the learning that we've already done and promotes staying engaged in life and in activities. This is what really matters for that ongoing learning and challenging yourself. Just like you're doing in this session, every bit of effort helps to build your brain's bank and abilities. Recovery is possible through intentional wellness, those deposits into that brain bank. So, focusing on healthy habits, cognitive strategies, and balanced living will support your progress. And remember, again, Brain Injury Services is here to help you. Our goal is to help you discover what strategies will work best for you and for your life. So every small step counts. Recovery is not a race, but it takes consistent and purposeful effort. And that's what really makes the difference. So, with all of that, I'll highlight our next week's webinar. So, in Brain Injury 103, an introduction to brain injury services, we are going to talk about how we take part one of this webinar series where we did brain injury. We talked about brain injury basics and understanding what brain injury is and how we classify it. It's going to combine that with Brain Injury 102, where we talk about the foundation for a holistic recovery from brain injury and tie it all together with how we here at Brain Injury Services help to take that information about you or your loved one who has experienced a brain injury and how we connect you with resources, help you to build goals and intentions and priorities to help you focus on that fixed mindset and address your road to recovery. So, we'll talk about the programs that exist at Brain Injury Services next week. We'll talk about how we work with you to establish personal goals and priorities for your recovery, and a little bit about how we connect you with outside resources as well, and more about how to get in contact with us and the expectations that you can have working with staff at our agency. So we look forward to you joining us next week. same day. It'll be Wednesday at 11 o'clock. And if you're watching this later recorded, our webinars are available on our website as well. So, with that, we just want to thank you again for joining us for part two of our brain injury education series. So, one of our chat hosts will put the feedback survey into the chat. So, if you're watching this webinar live, please take a moment to click on that link and fill out our survey. We're always looking for more feedback from those who are watching our webinars, and you can always reach out to us as well via email, which was at the beginning of this presentation. So with that, we have some time left, so we'll turn it over if there's anyone that would like to ask any questions or give, as Jess mentioned, feedback about what activities help fuel your brain bank. We can go ahead and look through those now before we wrap up today.
Yes, and I saw someone did comment being here. So thank you so much for joining us, and for adding that to our discussion.
All right. So we had a question. Um, how do you work with a mindset when you have severe anhedonia? Which is a term that I'm actually not familiar with. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Jess, but I can
Yes.
go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to the person who asked this question. And so, for those who are not as familiar with this term, anhedonia, to kind of summarize, is essentially that loss of interest, kind of like apathy, which can be very common when somebody maybe is feeling depressed, and is also a common symptom of brain injury. And so when somebody is feeling that anhedonia, we might talk with them about, depending on the program that they're a part of, what does motivate you? What types of successes can we build on or strengths that you have? Um, Especially because this can really impact somebody's mental health, we would encourage them to continue to talk with maybe a therapist, consider medical treatment, such as maybe medication management or another alternative. And additionally, talking with others in a support group, because again, this is not something that is, it's not identical across brain injury, but there are so many common patterns across those that we serve. And so this anhedonia may come up in a support group, and there may be others who can share, their feedback and their experiences in how they were able to navigate this. And thank you again for that question. That really is a big challenge. And so, um, yeah, thank you so much for that.
And thank you, Jess, for giving us a little lesson there on a new vocab term. I appreciate it. Okay, so we've got a question from one of our attendees about sleep, which I'm so happy to talk through this question. So, if our concussion causes sleep issues, how do we manage this when this is the major cause of the sleep issues? So, those of you attending this call may or may not be surprised to hear that sleep is one of the most common symptoms and challenges that we hear about for anyone who is living with a brain injury, whether it's a concussion or another classification. So, this is an area that, as you might imagine, with that, it comes with a lot of individual um, uh, parts and influences. So we often will recommend seeing, again, a neurologist who might have experience managing sleep issues. They might refer you out to a sleep specialist who will do sleep studies outside of our agency. But within our agency, we also have departments and staff who are experienced with individual sleep strategies and compensation things that you can try. Um, Things like using blackout curtains, developing a good sleep hygiene routine, reducing screen time, reducing food and water before bed. These are just some of the common recommendations. But if you are someone who struggles with sleep challenges, I strongly encourage you to bring that to the attention of the individual staff member who you're working with most closely at Brain Injury Services. And that person will be happy to talk through some of the individual challenges that you might be having and then connect you, whether it's to our internal departments that might have some more strategies to assist with that, or if it's to the level of severity that we want to look at outside resources, they'll be happy to connect you with resources outside as well. And Jess, I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that.
No, thank you. I think that's great. And for those who are interested in talking a little bit about those strategies and seeing kind of how that looks within our programs, we definitely do encourage you to join next week as we talk in a little bit more detail about programs like Compass, which is the program that Sheridan is a part of. And so, Sheridan, did you want to answer that next question about learning languages?
Sure. So the question is, I'm learning German. This is great for the brain, but it's very stressful. I already know and speak the easy languages, which is awesome. What do you suggest? I love learning languages, but German is very difficult. Well, this is another pretty individual question that would take a little bit more unpacking to really dive into. But as just mentioned, at Brain Injury Services, we work with you to kind of see what the different aspects of a goal like that might be. For example, what level of technology that you're comfortable with. We can look at different apps and websites. Like I'm sure if you've learned a lot of languages, you're familiar with things like Duolingo and other apps that can kind of turn learning a language into more of a cognitive game where you're getting rewards and releasing neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin to help promote that learning process. But learning languages, just like learning any new skill, takes a lot of practice. And in the case of learning following a brain injury, or really for anyone, even someone who has a neurotypical presentation or does not have any cognitive challenges, can be really difficult and requires a lot of trial and error. Also, it can involve looking at things outside of just the task of learning that language. For example, what the environment looks like in your home or in the library where you're doing your learning, developing a routine or habits around that learning. Even in the case of this question, learning something really difficult that is stressful can involve trying different coping strategies to manage that stress. One of the strategies that I use with myself and with a lot of my clients is really setting timers for those challenging tasks so that you don't find yourself spinning your wheels trying to learn something that's stressful, reducing that progress and then just completely wearing yourself out so that fatigue does not promote consistent or new learning. So as is the broken record at this point on this webinar, all of these types of questions are very individualized. But our point for our session next week is to talk with you about some of the details of the programs that are here at Brain Injury Services that might help you to unpack and parse through some of those individual factors that will affect a goal like that. But that's a great question, and we appreciate that question.
Yeah, thank you, Sheridan. And I'm sure again that this person, if they've learned several languages, they may know of some resources that are kind of their go-to in terms of learning languages. But for anybody else who is watching, I know that there are a lot of free things out there which may be helpful. And so an example is through the local libraries in Northern Virginia, there is often a program called Hoopla. which is HOOPLA, which is I believe, an online tool for maybe downloading different types of audiobooks or programs to kind of learn different languages. And so I hope that will be useful to somebody. But of course, if you have a question like this and it's really individualized, again, feel free to, continue to join next week's session and kind of break that down a little bit. As well, talk with your staff person at Brain Injury Services, and maybe we can help you brainstorm some different ideas that will really work for you. And so thank you again for that question. And I also want to answer this other question that we have here in the chat, or in the Q&A, I mean, which is, I feel I keep defaulting to negative. And so I need help redirecting those thoughts. And that is such a huge challenge that we often see among those that we work with. And this could include not just the clients, but also their family members and loved ones who really want to help and aren't quite sure how. And so, a conversation I had actually earlier this week with a client was a little bit of psychoeducation about kind of reaching for something more neutral. And so, Sheridan mentioned earlier kind of this idea of toxic positivity. And so, what we're not recommending is constantly kind of forcing yourself to think positive and to see the bright side of everything, because that can really minimize the experience you're having, because those challenges are really real and very valid. And so this is just one example of a tool that you might try, which is kind of aiming for more of that middle ground. So it's not all positive or all negative. Maybe it is kind of using a little bit of that growth mindset that I'm still having some trouble with this and I'm working on it. And I just learned this strategy, or I did really well yesterday when I tried this tool. So kind of getting that balance there of good and bad. And again, this is not the only tool that you can use to help with this. In cases where it's really starting to affect, your mood and your day to day. Of course, I am not a mental health professional, and so my recommendation would be to consider if you're open to something like mental health counseling, whether that is, general talk therapy, maybe it is group therapy. But again, please feel free to reach out to your staff person if you need some help finding resources to support your mental health. Sheridan, did you want to add anything to that? Or did anybody else have any questions that they'd like to drop in our Q&A?
No, I think that was a great kind of overview of some of the ways to address this very important question, which again, another extremely common one. I doubt that there's anyone that has been living with a brain injury that hasn't had challenges with negative thoughts. And I will circle back to Jess mentioned support groups as well, and we talked about the importance of community and social connection when managing a chronic illness like a brain injury, and just sometimes talking through some of those and getting experiences from others in similar situations, not exactly the same, can be very helpful, and even learning some of the strategies that have worked for others as well can be quite helpful. Well, I am not seeing anything else in the chat at this time, so we want to just take this opportunity to thank you again for participating in today's live webinar, or for coming to our website and clicking on this webinar. We have one more in this brain injury education series, and that's going to be next week, where we'll talk about an introduction to brain injury services and the client experience when working with us. So we hope that you'll join us for that session next week. And in the meantime, focus on holistic health and recovery, and we look forward to seeing you next week.